Well, we might begin our second session in the interest of keeping to time. We now turn to think about social policy in post-secular times, and we have two papers in this session as well. So our first speaker, who I'm delighted to welcome, is Professor Sarah Shortall from the University of Notre Dame in the US, talking about the historical shifts in philosophical and theological contexts around the common good and beyond. So welcome, Sarah, and over to you.
Hi, can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yep. Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be with you, albeit virtually and from very, very far away. So today I've been asked to speak about developments both in theology and in philosophy and kind of the secular humanities and social sciences. So I'll give some overview of how I think the conversation about the role of religion in public life has evolved over the past 30 years among scholars in the social sciences. And then I'll talk about theology, and I'll conclude by offering some reflections on where I think there are some affinities maybe between these two fields. So as I'm sure you're all familiar with, the scholarship on religion and public life has long been dominated by the theory of secularization, which comes to us from the classic 19th century theorists like Karl Marx, Auguste Comte, and Max Weber, most famously, who believed that religion was destined to exit public life, to become privatized, and that the disenchantment of the world was proceeding apace. And the 1960s, I think I see as the high watermark of this theory, in part because during this period, we see a really sharp decline in religious vocations, in church attendance. You see many women leaving religious life, for example, in the United States, North America, and Europe, especially Western Europe. And so this seems to vindicate these classic theories of secularization. But then in the past 30 years or so, there's been a real backlash against these theories. Starting, I think, first in the 1990s with people like the Spanish sociologist Jose Casanova, who, noticed several examples around the world, such as the Solidarity movement in Poland, which was so instrumental to the fall of communism there, liberation theology in Latin America, the Iranian Revolution in 1979, and of course the rise of the religious right in the United States in the 1980s. And he saw this as evidence that, in fact, religion was not becoming privatized, and in fact that there was a process of deprivatization occurring. And so he argued that we needed to revise the classic theory of secularization, that some elements were still valid, like the idea of a functional differentiation between secular spheres of political life and religious institutions. So the separation of church and state, basically, but that we shouldn't confuse that with the privatization of religion, that was not constitutive of secularization. And then I think this sort of line of thinking really takes off after September 11th, 2001, for fairly obvious reasons that made clear that religion was not departing from public life, that it remained a powerful, motivating force. And this spawns just a massive wave of scholarship on this question. So there's all of this interest in political theology, and especially the work of the German Nazi jurist Carl Schmitt, who famously argued that all modern political concepts are secularized theological concepts. So he undertakes a kind of theological genealogy of modern political concepts. There's also, this is when Charles Taylor, the Canadian philosopher, writes his magisterial work on secularization theory called A Secular Age. But I think the thing that most kind of crystallizes this kind of crisis of faith in secularism is the work of Jürgen Habermas in these years. He's sort of one of the preeminent defenders of sort of liberal secular democracy. And he, in this period, has this famous dialogue with Joseph Ratzinger, future Benedict XVI. where he begins to sort of recognize that maybe religion does have some useful resources, some normative resources to provide for securing democratic structures. Now, he still thinks that religious values need to be translated into what he sees as the universal, neutral, secular language of public reason in order for them to have political purchase. But he begins to recognize that they do offer a certain kind of meaning-making, motivating, moral authority, and especially that they can, I think, secure a kind of social solidarity that maybe is lacking from a purely procedural liberal account of democratic legitimacy. I'm not sure he would fully admit that, but I think that's the anxiety that's underpinning a lot of his work in these years. And then finally, there's a kind of a wave of scholarship that I would characterize as a kind of critique of secularism by figures like Talal Asad, Wendy Brown, Sabah Mahmood, people working in a Foucauldian tradition, who show that secularism is not the absence of religion from public life. It's not state neutrality vis-a-vis religion, that it's an ideology, that it's a manifestation of state power. And it's the way that the state manages religions and polices what public forms religion can take. So it's not just about excluding religion from public life, it's about policing what acceptable public religion looks like. Okay, so this was all of the scholarship that I was reading when I was writing my dissertation, which became my book. I found it sort of unsatisfying in some ways because I thought it really didn't engage very much with theology. For all of the interest in political theology, there wasn't much engagement with what theologians were actually writing amongst these secular scholars. So that's sort of what I set out to look at in my book, which looks at the generation of Roman Catholic theologians in France, working in sort of the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, who become very influential at the Second Vatican Council. So people like Henri de Lubac, Jean Danielou, Marie-Dominique Chenu, Yves Congar, and then people like Jacques Maritain as well are in there. And these figures are key because they come of age in France right after the separation of church and state in 1905, which is the culmination of this really bitter anti-clerical campaign that really polarizes church and state. And so that historical moment really forces them to ask serious questions about what the role of the church should be once the institutions of public life have been secularized, and how can the church be in the secular public sphere but not of it, right? How can it be involved but not compromise its values in the process? And so what I do in the book is I show there are various different answers to this question that theologians and philosophers come up with depending on their theological positions. But I think what all of them share is this understanding that there's really no going back to the medieval alliance of throne and altar, to the confessional state. But also they're equally kind of resistant to the privatization of religion, the notion that religion should be confined to the private sphere. So they're trying to articulate this sort of middle ground in between these two things. So even though they embrace the separation of church and state, this doesn't mean that they embrace liberalism. And in fact, they're very critical of many of the basic premises of liberal politics, like the primacy of the individual, the sovereignty of the nation state, and the separation between the private and public spheres. And this makes them very hard to plot politically. They sort of defy the logic of right and left in many ways. And the other thing that's noteworthy about them is that they tend to frame the relationship between theology and politics in somewhat oblique or indirect terms. Like they're reluctant to draw a kind of direct relationship between, or a direct line from theology to policy making. And this gets back to what I was saying about their desire to sort of steer this line between the confessional state and the privatization of religion. They want neither confusion nor separation between theology and politics. And they recognize that, Catholicism is a social faith through and through, so it cannot leave the structures of temporal life unchanged. but also that religion and politics can't simply be collapsed into one another, because that is actually a demotion for the church, right? This is why they think the separation of church and state is a good thing for the church, because when the church lays claim to jurisdiction over temporal life, that's a kind of demotion of its authority to the rank of a worldly authority. So that's why they sort of arrive at this in-between position where they understand that theology and politics can't be fully disarticulated, even as they must never simply be conflated. And I think this can be a useful lesson to keep in mind in an age when so many people do draw a direct line from their faith to a particular politics. Now, after Vatican II, there is, I think, a shift to back towards a more robust political role for Catholicism in some quarters. And I would give two examples here. Liberation theology is probably the most obvious in Latin America, which really rejects what it calls the separation of planes model, this notion that the temporal and the spiritual sphere should be distinct, that the church should sort of keep out of actively being involved in politics. And the argument that liberation theologians make is that even when the church claims not to be doing politics, that is itself a political choice in favor of the status quo, that it ends up reinforcing the power of elites. And so in a context of radical inequality, as you find in Latin America, the church needs to make a self-conscious choice to stand with the poor and the oppressed. The other example that I would give of this kind of renewed interest or kind of effort to reclaim politics is radical orthodoxy, which I think we'll hear more about in the next session. But broadly speaking, this is a post-liberal critique of the overweening power of the state and the market. And it too rejects the distinction between religion and politics because it sees it as foundational to the mythology of the modern state. This idea that the state emerged to save us from the violence of the wars of religion by confining religion to the private sphere. So both of these movements are trying to reclaim politics in some way, but I think also adopting a wider definition of politics beyond simply state power. So, one of the curious things to conclude here that I observed at the very end of my book is the way that there's been a kind of convergence in some ways between developments in secular philosophy and in theology. And radical orthodoxy, I think, is a great example of this because I see some real affinities between what some of these figures like Milbank, Kavanaugh, are trying to do, and figures like Assad, Sabah Mahmoud, some of these critics of secularism working in a Foucauldian framework. So they're both very invested in this critique of secularism and the myth of religious violence, the myth that religion is uniquely violent, which serves to kind of justify secular or state forms of violence. And they're also very attentive, I think, to the forms of power and exclusion that often lurk within apparently emancipatory or neutral liberal projects like secularism, religious freedom, human rights, right? The way that these can also reinforce the power of the state over human life or naturalize various religious, racial, and gender hierarchies. There's also been a turn in recent years in continental philosophy towards theology and an interest in some of the kind of pre-modern Christian sources. Like an example of this would be the interest in St. Paul on the part of political philosophers like Alain Badiou, Slavoj Žižek, and Giorgio Agamben. So there's been this kind of real renewed interest in theology, I think. And so what accounts for this? Well, part of what I try to show in the book is that it's actually not a new thing, that for much of the 20th century, secular philosophy and theology were very much in dialogue, that Catholic theologians and philosophers made crucial contributions to areas of secular philosophy like existentialism and phenomenology, the Hegelian revival, the philosophy of history, human rights discourse, totalitarianism theory. So we shouldn't just see this kind of recent work as a new thing, right? That this kind of exchange has always been going on under the surface. But I do think there is something to be said about maybe a certain set of affinities between what we might broadly call postmodern thought, secular postmodern thought, and kind of Catholic anti-modernism in their shared suspicion of some of the key features of modern thought, including, the cult of reason, of instrumental reason, the agentive autonomous subject, who's an individual first and foremost, and whose freedom is incompatible with a radical dependence on others or on God, the free market and the sovereign state, and also kind of linear notions of historical progress. So I think that's an area where we find a lot of commonality between some of these kind of secular postmodern thinkers and theologians. And I just want to end though with a little caveat, because I think there are also some limits to the critique of liberalism. When I wrote this book, it was a very different political moment, and I have to say that the critique of liberalism feels a bit different now, especially at a moment when liberalism is so much under threat, and especially we see this kind of surge of Christian nationalism. I think we need to be very careful when engaging in this critique not to play into the hands of that kind of discourse, in the way that, for example, Pope Francis in his encyclical Fratelli Tutti, tried to articulate a kind of alternative to both liberal individualism and populism. So I think that's very important. But I do think the theological critique of liberalism can help us to understand why the liberal consensus broke down, why it might be unsatisfying to some people, and maybe help us to think about how we can develop a thicker ethical framework to ground democratic norms and institutions. But as was raised at the end of the last panel, I think the key challenge here is how to articulate this kind of substantive ethical foundation, the sense of the common good, in a way that's inclusive, that is not exclusionary or alienating to non-religious actors. And this was something that the figures that I look at in my book were also really concerned with, because they recognized that pluralism was a kind of constitutive feature of modern politics. So, Jacques Maritain, his work with the UN in the development of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, is really engaging with this problem of how can you develop a distinctively Catholic account of the human person and the common good that can also speak to non-Catholics. So that seems to me to be like the key challenge moving forward in these debates. Thank you.